today's talk obviously is citrus care, and it's a big topic. There's lots of things to know about citrus trees, but I thought I might start with saying that probably the most popular tree we've sold over so many years are lemon trees, and they still are to this day the most popular tree out of everything in the whole nursery is what we sell. There's a bit of a trend these days to dwarf citrus. A lot of people have got smaller gardens and smaller spaces in the garden, balcony gardens where they can't grow the traditional old big lemon tree, and they're converting to pots and growing plants in pots. So there's a range of lemon trees now and other citrus trees which lend themselves to growing in a pot, and you may know about those. This is been around for quite a number of years, and they're sort of re-promoting it now as a great lemon for a pot. And as the name suggests, lots of lemons. It is a very prolific fruiting plant once it starts. My mother has one in her garden which she probably bought when they were first released, say 20 years ago. And it's this sort of height and the same sort of width. It doesn't grow any bigger than that, but it's always loaded with fruit. It gets lots of fruit on it. It's not grafted, it's been grown from a cutting, but it seems to fruit a lot earlier than what some other citrus trees do. So, and it's a compact tree, it's a good compact sized tree, and quite a good tasting fruit as well. So,
does it need to be pruned?
I prune hers probably once a year. Just it tends to get some upright growths on it which look out of character from the rest of the plant. So I just tend to chop those off, but that's the only pruning it gets really. And I'm always loath to prune it because at some stage when I go to prune, it's got lots of fruit on it. So I don't want to cut the fruit off it, obviously. But very tough plant, and grows in the pot quite happily. Citrus all love sun, of course, so probably, and that goes for any type of citrus tree, at least 5 to 6 hours sun a day. And
even in a pot?
Even in a pot, yeah. So if you put them in, predominantly shaded areas, they don't flower because they're not getting enough sun. And if they don't flower, you don't get the fruit, of course. So try to give them at least 5 to 6 hours sun a day, ideally. So that's a good compact variety if you haven't got a lot of space and you want lots of fruit. There are others. That one's what's called lemonicious, and lemonicious tends to have, it's related to this one, it tends to have bigger fruit and still a fairly compact plant. These have recently been pruned, but that again would probably grow up to about so high. It has a natural rounded sort of habit, so if you don't want it to grow really big and bulky, that would be probably the way to go. And again, another good one for a pot. Does fruit very well, probably doesn't get as much fruit as what this does, but again it does tend to have fruit throughout the year. Traditionally lemons only used to fruit say once or twice a year, so you have all your crop coming at one time. You don't need it. So they're sort of trying to develop them now where they fruit continuously throughout the year, so you've got staggered fruit. Both of these are a sweeter lemon, which are good for cooking. They're quite good with their taste. That one's a bit bigger, the fruit's a bit larger on it, but you can see how it has that natural sort of rounded habit.
Can you tell me then about the Lisbon, because that's what I thought is a Lisbon.
So Lisbon's the big old citrus tree that's the largest out of all of them. It probably grows about 4 metres high.
Oh, that's
It has very big fruit. It's a traditional sour lemon. Has a thicker skin, but a good juice, a lot of juice in it. A lot of Italian and Greek people love the Lisbon lemon. It's their traditional lemon that's grown overseas. The downside of it tends to have big spines on it, quite large thorns, which can be a nuisance if you've got kids running around or animals running around. But it is a good fruiter. Tends to fruit twice a year, mainly in spring and autumn. Whereas the Eureka which is another sour lemon. It tends to fruit all the time. You normally always have fruit on a Eureka lemon. I mentioned limes. There's probably one main good fruiting lime for Melbourne. That's the Tahitian lime. It tends to tolerate the cold better. There's a West Indian lime which you can grow here, but it doesn't tend to fruit as well because of the cold climate. If you get it in the right spot in a Melbourne garden, then the West Indian lime's okay, but the best one is the Tahitian lime. These are probably limes here. That looks like a lime. They too have thorns, but yeah, that's Tahitian lime. But they're not too bad. Not a huge tree, probably grows up to about 2 metres high and probably 1.5 metres wide. And fruits once a year, tends to fruit in the middle of winter, around about July. But they're good size, limes. The longer you leave the lime on the tree, the more sweet it becomes. It actually turns from green to yellow and it becomes sweeter. So it's quite a nice lime to make drinks out of. So that's Tahitian lime, and it's the most cold tolerant. I should mention with any citrus, they all need a well-drained soil, not clay-based soil. This area is generally very heavy clay-based, and it's difficult to find a spot in those soils for a lemon or citrus tree to grow. Often you've got to build the garden bed up, like an elevated garden bed, so that the plant's got decent drainage around it. If you plant them into clay, they're often stunted, or they often get too wet and all the leaves tend to fall off. So drainage is really important. Sun I've mentioned. The other thing is they generally need lots of food. Citrus trees love lots of fertiliser, particularly coming out of winter when the weather's been really cold. The plant needs the food to kick it on, and just a general good citrus food is...
So is it a different food for lemons trees in pots as opposed to being in the ground?
Yeah, often it is, because some of the ones you use in the garden are stronger, and if you use them in the pot, they're more inclined to burn the plant. So in a pot, I'd be either using, that one's a general fruit citrus food. This is a granular fertiliser, so that's a lot stronger. I wouldn't use that in a pot because it's too strong. It's likely to burn the roots. Fine in the garden, and it's probably the quickest acting out of all of the fertilisers for citrus trees, but not recommended for pots. For a pot, I'd be using either a slow release like that. This is similar to Osmocote. You probably know Osmocote, and Osmocote make one for citrus. These generally last about 3 or 4 months, so they're convenient. Feed them once in spring and then again in autumn. And they're safe to use for pots. So if you tend to be a bit heavy-handed, it's not really going to matter. The plants will be okay. Or there's Harry's. You've probably heard of Harry's products. They make a whole range of different specialty fertilisers. They make gardenia food, which is particularly good. And they also do one for citrus, and you could use that safely in a pot. This is a bit like blood and bone consistency. It's like a powder, so it's safe to use either in the garden or in the pot. The whole thing is, as long as you're feeding, and feeding regularly, because they do need it. Often the citrus go yellow. I haven't got one here, particularly on the new leaves. They go a really bright yellow if they're lacking fertiliser. So that's a good indicator if you need to feed. So something like that I probably use 2 or 3 times through the warmer months of the year. You don't need to feed in winter because the plants are dormant in the winter time, but at least 2 or 3 times through the spring and summer. Pests, probably the main pest we get asked about all the time is the gall wasp. That's probably the most common one in particularly lemon trees, and we think a lot of it's probably because there's so many lemon trees out there. Everybody tends to have a lemon tree, and the insect tends to jump from one tree to the next.
So it'll just jump from a lemon tree to a kumquat.
Well, it's a native wasp. It's native to southern New South Wales, and because the winters are becoming milder, the insects become, normally when it used to migrate into Melbourne, it used to be affected by the cold. It never used to survive winter. But we're finding now that it's sort of acclimatised, and because the winters aren't as fierce as what they used to be, the insect survives winter, and of course come spring there's just a huge explosion of numbers in the garden. Most people don't do anything about it, and of course it just jumps from one tree to the next. And there isn't any chemical remedy for it. All you can really do is prune it out of the tree as it occurs, destroy the prunings, and try to keep the tree strong by feeding it and watering it well. But it's a pretty common insect in citrus, probably the worst that affects citrus trees. I might add the trees that aren't treated still grow and they still will fruit. It puts a lot of stress on the tree, so you don't tend to get as many fruit, or the fruit won't be as good, but the tree survives. It can look a bit tired, if you get lots of it in the tree, particularly older trees.
So they take the sap out of the tree or something?
Well, they the insect, it's a flying insect, so it lays eggs in the branches of the trees, particularly in new branches, and from the egg there's a little worm that hatches out. That little worm sort of feeds on the internal part of the branch. The tree reacts a bit like probably as an analogy, like a cancer. It swells up around it, gets all these cell growth around where the insect's attacking. So the swelling is caused by the insect, but it's the tree that's reacting to the insect. So normally they recommend you cut out those swellings as they occur because the insect's still inside. If any of the swellings have got little holes in them, the insect's gone. It's turned back into a wasp when it's bored its way out, so it's too late. It's normally the newer growth on the perimeter of the tree that you want to try and prune it out of. Feed the tree well, water the tree well. It tends to make it a bit more resistant to being attacked by the insect. There's another insect which is affecting citrus at this time of the year called leaf miner. And I haven't got a sample of it, but it attacks the new leaves and it causes the leaves to curl over. And if you look at the leaves, they've got like a little window, a wriggly line window in the new growth. And that's also caused by a flying insect which lays eggs under the skin of the leaf.
That's what I had online then. I found him at Squash.
Yeah, that's a good idea. No, it's always around now. We get a lot of them coming at this time of the year. Generally late summer is when it's more noticeable. So because it's only in the new growth, the easiest thing to do is either squash it or go through and prune out the affected parts. It's normally just those new growths that you have to cut out.
I only had it home 2 weeks. What's happened to it? That's what it was.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't do a lot of damage. It looks worse than what it is.
Okay.
So if you didn't do anything, it wouldn't matter. But if you don't like it, you just prune it out. What you do have to do as a preventative measure, when you get a lot of new growth in the springtime on your citrus tree of any type, you can attack any citrus tree, you've got to spray that new growth with white oil. Because the white oil puts a film on the leaf and it stops the insect laying eggs into the leaf.
Okay.
So as soon as you see all that burst of new growth in the springtime, that's the time to spray it. They're prone to a few bugs, but the other insect they tend to get in big numbers is scale, black scale or brown scale, and that's seasonal on citrus trees. Scale looks like a brown or a black lump on the branches themselves. Like it can be under the leaves, tends to attach itself to the mid-rib of the leaf, down the centre of the leaf, or on the top of the leaf, or down the main branch. They look like a little half shell, like a brown or a black shell, and the insect covers itself in a waxy coating, which is what that shell is, and it lives underneath it and it feeds on the sap of the plant. And often you get black sooty mould on the leaves, where all the leaves get like a black powder on the leaf, and that's an indication that you've got scale, because the black powder feeds off the sugars as the insect feeds on the plant. It excretes sugars, and the black sooty mould goes for the sugars. And often you get ants running around because the ants are going for the sugars as well. So whenever you see the ants or the black on the leaf, you know you've got scale. The control for scale is white oil again.
Okay.
But it has to come in contact with the insect to kill it. So if you've got scale here or down the branches, unless the oil contacts the insect, it won't kill it because it smothers the insect. So if you only spray part of the plant, or you only spray the top of the leaves and it's underneath the leaves, it won't work. You have to spray the whole plant. So that's one to look out for. Scale is pretty common. A lot of the citrus trees are grafted. I mentioned these ones, they're not grafted. These have been grafted. You can see clearly where the graft is. When you plant a citrus tree, it's very important not to bury the graft. It's a general rule for most trees, but particularly citrus trees. Often they graft them very high on the stem, like that there. This is the Meyer lemon. I'll make a comment about these two in a minute. There's the graft there, right? This would have been the original tree that was growing and then they've grafted onto it. The reason it's a long way between the soil and the graft is for disease. So if that was planted under the ground, it would certainly be a certain death for the tree. They're very prone to a disease called collar rot, and it's worse when the graft is low down on the plant. It's more prone to getting it. So when you see citrus trees, they're often, like a rose plant's often grafted, say, down here, but a citrus tree, they graft it high so it's less prone to disease. A lot of citrus trees come into the nurseries with fruit on them, like that little tree. It's always good practice to remove the fruit when you plant it. The temptation is to leave it because it's got fruit on it, and that's great. The problem is the tree will put all its energy into the fruit and it will sacrifice growth on the tree. So the first couple of years, normally 18 months, 2 years, you remove any fruit that might occur, let the tree establish, and then let it fruit after that. Otherwise this becomes stunted and it doesn't grow much because the tree's trying to reproduce, it's trying to produce seed and fruit and puts all this energy into that rather than into growing the tree itself.
So would that apply to a finger lime as well?
Yeah, well look, not so much because they're only little, and you don't tend to get that many finger limes on the one plant.
Okay.
But for the larger fruiting types, I'd say, yeah, you should remove them. I mean, maybe you could leave one or two, but it's better to remove it. You'll find the tree will grow a lot better and a lot quicker if you take that off.
And with the finger limes, do they like light, a lot of light?
Yes, all love the sun.
More light the
The
better?
main problem with finger limes, a bit like normal limes in Melbourne, they're affected with the cold. Because it's a tropical citrus tree, these originate from northern Queensland areas, up through that as high as Cairns. When you bring them into Melbourne in the winter, they love this sort of weather, but when you bring them into Melbourne in winter, they're going to be affected by frost. So we've had them on the benches here where that new growth has been burnt off in the winter time with the frost, which you just prune off and away the tree goes again, but...
With mandarins, we've got 1.5 wine barrel, and last year it was very prolific. Prolific.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, they fruit in winter, don't they?
They do.
Well, it
They've got
seems
much
to
on
be
it.
a bit slow getting off at the moment this year.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because last year it was so...
Some fruit trees, what they do, they tend to be what they call biennial. So you'll get a huge crop one year, and the next year you won't get much at all.
Oh, okay.
Some of the plum trees are prone to doing that. You get a really good crop one year and hardly anything the next year. You can sort of counteract it to a certain extent by feeding. A lot of it's weather related.
Yeah, true.
But you should get some fruit every year. If you're not getting any fruit, then there'll be another problem with the tree. But it's not unusual for them to get a heavy crop and then not much of a crop the following year.